Welcome back, everyone, for part two. Typhoons are coming with Aaron Goldstein, Scott Scheferman on Cyber Talk with Nikolay. Yeah, you guys spoiling all the fun. It's like zero trust supposed to save all and everyone. So we trust no one, and especially when somebody is coming from China, it's like how can you trust all this traffic coming from there? So I guess it doesn't work. Well, to a certain extent. So let's switch our wheels and move to Cell Typhoon. So I'm going to skip Flux Typhoon. It seems like it was a variation of Volt Typhoon that attacking similar targets. But Cell Typhoon brought a lot of pain, I would say. Right now, I couldn't really find a whole lot on Cell Typhoon, what's been done and the extent of it. But since a lot of media outlets start reporting on it, and obviously it's affected three organizations, at least for now, AT&T, CenturyLink, or Lumen, and Verizon. But the extent of it, it could be a lot further and a lot more impactful than somebody is thinking at the moment. So what is your take on it? Because right now, again, it seems like when we discussed Volt Typhoon, the same devices were involved in allowing threat actors get into companies' environments and operate there. So when I heard about Cell Typhoon and start looking into reports, it seems like same Cisco devices are still there, and threat actors got in there probably the same way. So I'm going to ask you the same question. So if you can think about it, talk about it, and describe what you've seen, what you understand about the Cell Typhoon, because again, right now we have a lot bigger extent because in a way they got access to US wiretapping through all these carriers. So they can monitor the traffic, they can exact from that traffic whatever they need to, and then they use this information. We don't know what actually information's been stolen or access to, but at the end of the day, they pretty much have unfettered access, and they've been sitting there for quite some time. So I haven't seen a report that definitively says for how long Cell Typhoon was operating within those organizations, but I'm pretty sure they've been there not for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. They've been there for quite longer period of time. So what's your take, guys?
Well, I'll do a high level, Aaron, kick us off. So the how else do I say this? So the OPM breach was a bad day for national security. I liken this to that level of gravitas, potential impact, and very, 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 very likely, likely massive impact. The thing is, they didn't just hit. They had a lot of ISPs. The three we know of are the three that Nikolay just mentioned. But if you look at these ISPs, they're not just ISPs, right? If you look at Lumen, I mean, Lumen goes back a minute, back to like, that brings me back, right, to where I got started. But like, Lumen is not just an ISP, right? It's got Black Lotus Labs, one of the best, using the telemetry that a tier one ISP has, some of the best threat intelligence and reporting that you can imagine, some of the best minds in that field that they have. They have managed services that they provide extreme security, like a whole suite of security services, a full stack, right? They serve as a tier one, they serve very, very mission critical Department of Defense networks. They're not just like, you think of ISP, you think of like my phone and how I get data, but they're so much bigger and central as a nexus for what you can broadly describe as intelligence. Then when you take the wiretapping access that they specifically targeted and compromised, that's a whole nother level, because that now starts to affect DOJ, FBI, um, um, A few other agencies, three-letter agencies I don't even need to mention. You can infer anybody who can get a wiretapping request that has authorization to do that, it affects them. And it affects it can affect all three. It can affect availability. It can be used for counter espionage, meaning who are the US, who are the, let's say, Chinese nationals or spies in the United States that our government is watching and monitoring, so that then the Chinese government can notify them, hey, you're actually under surveillance, or hey, they've associated you with this other thing. And so it's counter espionage. It's also the ability to modify data, right? If you do that, you can actually send the wrong telemetry to our intelligence, so we make bad decisions. And finally, of course, you can disrupt or destroy some of that data. A lot of this is on the wire stuff, but there's also communications involved. There's messaging. There's threat products, if you will, or reports, if you will, that are exposés and things like this that give you context and background for what the reason for the tap is. So this is something that I liken to the OPM breach in terms of potential impact to national security. That's why the Biden administration has a special force that's literally only focused on this specific campaign and set of events. And I think this could cause tremendous harm. I think watching what's happening in Taiwan with the biggest exercise they've ever done, with hundreds and hundreds of planes. Um, you put all this together. You got our national elections. You got a lot going on at once, and this campaign was probably very useful, and hopefully was discovered and disrupted earlier than later in terms of the total potential of impact it could or may have caused, right? And if that's the case, we're all really, really lucky, but it doesn't mean we should sleep well at night at the same time. So I think this is probably the most important threat of campaign that we'll probably learn the least about. Is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF, put it really well. Putting the geopolitical pieces aside, this is why you don't allow government backdoors, because you can't always control who's going to have access to them. So by having these abilities for wiretaps and spying and things like that, and then being able to have a foreign entity compromise that, not only listen to it, like Scott was saying, but maybe even tamper with the intelligence and control what access is being fed, is absolutely just astonishing. And I think a lot of this is going to remain under wraps for a very long time before we'll ever get all of the details on it. On a more technical sense, I thought it was really interesting that what they were doing is essentially rooting into these Cisco firewalls and network devices, and then reprogramming them and adding their own capabilities to it. So I thought that was a really interesting approach. They're also known to be using some rootkits that are highly evasive and anti-forensic, meaning that it destroys logs and makes it difficult to do an investigation based on the artifacts that are left over, but also anti-analysis. So when you look at the malware samples and you look at the binaries and things of that nature, they are very elusive. So I find it to be really fascinating in that regard. And like Scott said, probably one of the most prolific attacks in recent time. And unfortunately, we're not going to get a lot of the details on it. Unfortunately, I think it's really unlikely that we get the details, especially from the big three that were compromised, and a real deep dive into what happened.
Well, the other thing about like Lumen, for example, they're not just domestic; they serve 60 other countries, right? So it's a huge win for China to get that as a tier one ISP. Those wiretaps are between an American citizen and somewhere else a lot of times, right? So, and that ISP has that backbone traffic assigned to it for 60 other countries. It's probably one of the largest tier ones in the world. Lumen is, and you don't really hear about it because you don't really order your cell phone service from it, but they're absolutely massive. Um, yeah, I feel like this one will have a lot of long leg type of impacts. Um, it's probably the MSS, which is, and specifically their technical department, if you will. Other people might know that from past years where we used to call that like the 3PLA group. And it's those folks don't mess around. Their initial vector tactics, other than the like Cisco edge devices, there actually is two other vendors I've heard in trust groups. I won't mention their names, but it's more than just Cisco. So no need to just throw Cisco under the bus here. They hit some of the other larger manufacturers of these edge devices as well to get in. And so, Nikolay, you were correct. If you look at both kind of campaigns, you see some commonalities in terms of this, and that's not for any other reason in my mind, because you want the biggest bang for your buck with the least chance of getting caught, and the easiest approach as well. All these operations have a budget, and it might be a large budget staffed with a lot of people in a proper organization, but it's still a budget. So what is the lowest cost, easiest, fastest way to get the most power and still be undiscovered? It's obviously these edge devices. It's a paradigm shift the last 4 or 5 years compared to spear phishing and all the other tactics that we would see with application vulnerabilities, etc. Um, yeah, there's more to say about this particular campaign in terms of impact and kind of global impact, if you will, and political impact, but I don't know if that's the scope of this conversation. It's
Um,
probably not a good idea to talk about that too much.
no, no, we can always come back. So, guys, from your perspective, Aaron, you mentioned there was a 30 years old federal law that allows certain number of employees to have backdoor to access all this traffic. And what I'm trying to see is like we had Volt Typhoon, and it seems like the same brands of devices were involved in Volt Typhoon. Then a year later, we come into year and a half. Actually, it's about a year later, we coming back to Typhoon, and the same devices are getting involved now on much broader scale. So, do you see it as some people looking at other people is like, okay, you guys get compromised and nothing is going to happen to us? Because my question is like, what certain organizations haven't learned from the past that just happened, thinking that the same thing, our techniques were completely different in this particular case, those devices got compromised and threat actors got in. Because again, reports are very scarce and I haven't seen exactly what happened, but there are a lot of speculations that people throw around there what potentially could happen. But I think one thing for certain it's two. This 30 years old federal law and Cisco devices in play.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always going to be this level of high risk around these edge devices and these appliances that hold the keys to the kingdom. So whether it's a Cisco device or a Fortinet or Ubiquity or whatever, I think that they're always going to be a high target, and anyone that has these motives to compromise and exfiltrate and leverage that data, they're always going to be targeting them. So as Scott was saying, if you see some type of compromise like this, you got to burn it down and get a new device. I mean, that's certainly a great plan. But who's to say that 3 months from now, an unknown, undisclosed 0 day against that new appliance is going to happen too? So I think it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, and defenders need to always just keep their guard up and always be looking for signs of compromise. No attack is perfect, right? So a threat actor, it's a core tenet of forensics is you can't commit, at least in this case, a digital crime without leaving some type of forensic artifact left over. And so I think it's just maintaining your vigilance, ensure that you have as much security posture as you can, and those layers to add logging and defense, and trust but verify, and make sure you're updating those appliances and keeping to date on these things. But realistically, I mean, you're not going to do much against a highly targeted attack, with seemingly endless budget from a government agency. It's going to take a lot more than that. So, all we can do is our best in that regard, and try and limit the exposure and make it as hard as we can.
I don't have too much to add to that, and that's because Aaron is just incredible at what he does. He always has been. One thing we didn't talk about that I would add to kind of that list is pay a lot of attention to trust at the technical level. Anywhere that you can apply the concept of trust, zero trust is like an offshoot of this thing, but like think about the certificates that you're trusting. re-review your whitelist, because if you have a whitelisting strategy, because that becomes dirty over time. Aaron, how many times did we see that during IR? The root of trust for all of compute, including these tier one telcos, is at the firmware hardware level. And the assumptions that we all have all been making are really getting busted wide apart. And it's not just the hardware and firmware, it's the whole stack, including the vendor drivers that ship with these motherboards for servers, hyperscaler environments, etc. It's not just the UEFI, it's also your baseboard management controllers. Like, think of these actors not as just living off the land above the kernel and in the operating space and application space, but also with the propensity, the ability, either through supply chain backdoors and vulnerabilities that are really just backdoors, like the very complex ones that came out with FortiGate the day before yesterday. Like, when you see a complex vulnerability that was discovered, it may or may not be a bunch of AI fuzzing techniques that and a crackpot group of researchers that figured out a finagling way to go through multiple levels of user land to get to admin land. And no, a lot of times it's these vulnerabilities. I truly believe, and this is only me, it's not any of my former or current employers saying this. I truly believe, based on the research I've witnessed with my own teams, that a lot of these backdoors are intentional and by design, and their complexity is only a form of obscurity so that they're not discovered by researchers sooner than they are otherwise exploited by the actors that are aware of them ahead of time. So trusting your IT supply, trusting all of your certificates, reviewing your certificates at the web level, at the local host level, at your whitelisting levels, these drivers and all of that is a core nexus. It's why living off the land works in the first place, because you've placed trust, you've given authorization, and you've pre-validated the actions that the actors are now leveraging against you. That paradigm, keep rethinking what you think you know and what you're assuming, and that'll really help you think more deeply about how you architect, how you build your security stack, what you think you need for visibility and human resources as well, and expertise. These are the things that when Aaron and I were doing DFIR are truly the things that end up biting large enterprises and telcos and infrastructure in the butt, because they're forced to make these assumptions in order to do business. And there's no one person in the hat whose job it is to look at trust itself as a problem and solve for it proactively and architect for it proactively. And I think that's where we're going to have to get better as a society. Head into the world of AI and quantum computing. You can't imagine how these trust assumptions are going to be leveraged against us.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. One question I have, and when you look at these two operations, or actually three operations that were performed by this Typhoon group, how or where would you put threat intelligence? Would we be able to get something like that advanced ahead of time through some channels? Or I haven't really seen much that anyone published. I know right now I have pretty much feeds full of all these indicators of compromise after the fact that everything has happened. And how would somebody at least have advanced warning? Would it be possible to have this level of threat intelligence to say, yeah, certain things are happening? Because a lot of organizations spend a lot of money right now on threat intelligence to understand and to gather this information before incidents happen, so at least they can minimize impact to organizations. So in case of this particular typhoons, how do you see it? Would it be impossible, or it's completely off the chart because they kept it so close to their chest and they wouldn't be releasing such information? Well, again, you can infiltrate Chinese organizations and see what they're doing, but probably it's going to be extremely hard.
That's that's the key. You just said it at the end. For like ransomware actors, yeah, we break into their command and control all the time, right? Like, and we can get kind of advanced intelligence and things like that. But through forums and dark web searches, it's much harder through the Chinese firewall getting into the MSS to understand them, even though there was a very significant leak, thank God, that gave us basically an entire playbook for how China approaches anything from a cyber perspective. It's basically like a hacking manual with a bunch of really cool tools that we've since, as researchers, taken apart and come to understand and actually even replicate for offensive purposes on our side, right? So, but I would say like it's two worlds. One, everything you get from like CISA is going to be late by definition, and that's not a knock. That's the reality of how information works. But at the same time, when you get that email from a new CISA KEV, you should really lean in on it because that KV is a known exploited, and it's very likely in the context of campaigns like the ones we've been talking about today. They're not there arbitrarily. It's not a wanton process to become a CISA KEV. There's only like 12, 1,300 of these things. And there's, one or two added a week or whatever, but those are really important. So have coverage for all of them to the best of your ability. Start there, and it's very defensible with the board. And that's just the CISA side. I mean, broader level threat intelligence and operationalizing that for these campaigns is difficult, but I'll turn it over to Aaron because there are things you could do at kind of the SOC level and the threat hunting level that are pragmatic, even if it's living off the land.
Yeah, I completely agree. The CISA indicators are absolutely important to look at. They're not releasing it just for fun. They're actual real world threats that have been causing real world impact. So, in addition to those, I think if you have the means, joining the ISACs, the intelligence sharing groups, or other intelligence areas where you can actually share with others in your industry and others that might be facing the similar type of threats, that can be a good way to do it. But as far as a lot of these, I mean, if you look at the actual endpoint techniques, the living off the land with the process creation via WMIC and LSAS dumping, those specific techniques you would see from hundreds of other threat groups as well. So those are very valid very valid indicators. And if you're seeing those, it doesn't mean that it's some cyber espionage advanced attack against you, but you should keep your eyes open for it, and you should look to try and provide some level of attribution towards it if you can. So I think working together with other groups in similar industries can be super helpful, leveraging the intelligence and the tools that you have to search and respond. And then also just for the alerts and indicators you do get, don't brush it off as, oh, this user's just doing user things, but maybe this is something a little more malicious, and, having a scrutinous eye on that type of behavior.
Yeah, you indirectly mentioned like enrichment, right, and attribution. In my career, I've come to love and hate attribution. I love it from a research perspective and writing blogs and having conversations like this. But pragmatically, I've always been of two minds because there's always been a large part of me that suggests to organizations and leaders to not worry about attribution almost at all. If you have an LSAS event or a WMI living off anything like that, you have lost security control. You have a big problem. You need to get ahead of it and understand it through the context that the data presents to you. So, like even during WannaCry, who did it? Well, at first people thought it was North Korea because it was using a crappy North Korean payload for ransomware that was poorly written, and there's some code overlap. No, obviously we all learned that was not what WannaCry was at all. But how many boards, how many leaders, how many threat intelligence people like us got our heads wrapped around that axle as that campaign was rolling through? And it's something like this. Do you really care if it's the MSS or the 3PLA? You probably shouldn't care because there's nothing you can do about it anyway. All you can do is worry about the data you have and the approach that you take and how measured that approach is. And that's what you should really double down on, and just don't worry about attribution when you have a strong indicator of compromise. Take care of the problem.
Got it, got it. All right. Thank you for that, guys. So before we part today, I have one last question. So if you can suggest one thing, and updating resume is not a valid thing to suggest in case when something like that happens. So when somebody detects the problem in their network and the magnitude that we're seeing here with typhoons, what would be one thing that you would suggest to incident responder they need to do in this case to minimize the impact and contain the situation to the best degree possible, because again, it's not ordinary event. It's obviously somebody detected something out of normal. Not to lead them in the directions like, okay, spend your time, do all the collection, bring on the logs from 10 years ago if you can find them, contact all those organizations that you dealt with. So that obviously not gonna help them a whole lot, and they will have to go to updating resume. But one meaningful step when they can bring it to their executive management to say, hey, I discovered this, and here's what I need you to help me with.
I got an easy one, then Aaron probably has better ideas than me anyway. For me, looking at this threat nexus, even including Flax Typhoon, knowing their propensity to prefer and target both edge and IoT devices, in a ransomware event, you don't always think about that as much as you think about the payload and the negotiating and all that stuff, right? Data leaving. For this campaign, if you get any indicators anywhere, whether it's on a host or a basic network level, DNS, whatever it is, I would like very quickly think about logical access, meaning wherever I have my indicator from, what can be seen from that interface at a network level. And I would analyze that almost like you're a hacker. I would literally take like a network scanner, which like, you would do to enumerate a network and understand, okay, I've got a Hikvision over there. I got an RV320 over there. I've got a Cisco switch over here. And I would really start looking at those logs as early as you can, but obviously everything's opportunity cost. If you're doing that, you're not doing something else. If you have to worry about Active Directory right off the riff, then you have to worry about Active Directory, right? But I would really suggest that you paint that priority earlier on in the process than you might otherwise with a different actor and a different motive. And patch. It sounds hilarious, but it's a race. Everything that happens, even it might take close for 3 months, it's still a race. They might move slow to evade and not trigger, but they're still in a race against you. So, you want to get ahead of their ability to persist on devices around in the environment that they're in. So you want to proactively patch them. People don't usually patch their firmware on switches and cameras and RV320s, and that's kind of the problem in the first place. So do that thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think visibility here is going to be critical for success. Knowing where those IoT devices are, where your edge appliances are, things of that nature. And what I'd add to that is really just don't be afraid to sound that alarm, but put guardrails on it. We don't want to cry wolf if we see a suspicious behavior and go to the board and say the sky is falling, everything is compromised. But what you can do is you can update your team and your incident commander and follow your incident response plan to say, we see signs of these important activities. They could be, a clear indication of a much larger, broad attack, but we want to spend the time to identify and narrow that down. You might get guidance from your leadership team on exactly what you should or should not be looking into, and they might help minimize that scope or help you understand, hey, you know what, this is something that has compromised our core devices. Maybe we need some external assistance to make sure we don't lose those artifacts. Maybe we need some guidance on, from third-party experts or vendors on what the best approach is here, not only to secure our network, to get them out of it and move forward in a secure way, but also to ensure that the artifacts and details that could help us really understand the breadth of this attack remain intact and can be collected properly.
I'm going to add one more thing. Is there's something you could do right now, which is if you're, let's say, an enterprise or critical infrastructure, I would literally pick up the phone and ask and then demand, depending on the answer, one thing. Above all, do not have your management interfaces exposed to the internet. Do not have RDP exposed to the internet. Do not do that thing. And if you think you're locked down because you have a policy that says don't do it, you're probably wrong, because over time that happens all the time and those things don't get turned back off. So you need to do that for your whole supply chain, and you need to do that for all of your stakeholders too. And that's why you pick up the phone. And if you haven't done that yesterday, then do it when you click the stop button on this video. right? Like, don't delay. That is absolutely the lowest hanging fruit in the year 2024 and beyond to do. Stop doing that. It's everywhere. You got to stop.
Yep, that's definitely true. Thank you guys for all your valuable advices. Great conversation. Certainly enjoyed having this with you, and thank you for coming on. Until next time, and if you have anything that you would like to share, the parting word for the audience, feel free.
I say just keep on fighting the good fight.
That's it. That's what we do. That's why we're here. And Nikolay, thank you for these podcasts in general and everything you've done. Thank you to ISSQUARED as well for everything they've done over the decades. They've been a large part of my own personal kind of trajectory and coming to understand what this space actually is and the problem we're actually trying to solve together. So yeah, just like Aaron said, thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on part 2 with Aaron Goldstein and Scott Scheferman on the episode Typhoons Are Coming, Cyber Talk with Nikolay. That's what we're all about. Together we're stronger. And wishing you all happy holidays and great season until I'll see you in January.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.